NBC was going to erase that tape. In 1969, that was the rule. Tonight Show episodes aired, tapes were erased, recorded over with something new. Thousands of hours of television history vanished that way. But on one particular night, a young technician in the tape room at NBC Burbank looked at the monitor and couldn't press the erase button. On screen, Johnny Carson, the most controlled man in American television, was losing it. Tears streaming, one hand slamming the desk, the other covering his face. And the reason was the man on the couch, Dean Martin, tuxedo flawless, glass in hand, smile crooked as always. The audience had stopped laughing at the jokes and started laughing at Carson laughing. The show had slipped out of everyone's control, and for once nobody in the booth reached for the cut button. That tape survived because one man couldn't stop watching, but the real story came 9 years later. 1978, same studio, same desk. Carson reached for Dean Martin's glass and for the first time in 16 years, drank on camera. They laughed, everyone laughed, but inside that sip was the weight of a 30-year friendship, of losses, and of everything the two men had never said out loud. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. To understand this story, it's not enough to know who Dean Martin was. You need to know who he wasn't. There was no such person as Dean Martin. His real name was Dino Paul Crosetti, born in 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio, in the smoke-covered shadow of steel mills. His father, Guy Crosetti, was an Italian barber. His mother, Angela, worked 14 hours a day. Italian was spoken at home, and on his first day of school, little Dino didn't know a single word of English. His classmates mocked his accent. His teachers sat him in the back row. That day, little Dino learned something. If you make people laugh, they take you in instead of beating you up. What you are about to hear is drawn from the details of two real lives, their documented struggles, their known histories, their private silences, and imagines the conversation that the evidence of those lives always seem to be pointing toward. The facts about Dean Martin are real. The facts about Johnny Carson are real. The meeting between them and what was said lives in the space between what we know and what we can feel must have been true. The road from Steubenville's steel mills to Hollywood was not short. Dino dropped out of school at 15. He became a boxer, fighting named Kid Crochet. They broke his nose. Then they broke it again. He worked as a croupier at illegal gambling tables. He sang in nightclubs, small, smoke-filled rooms with low ceilings, sometimes to 10 people, sometimes to 3. But he had a voice, the kind of voice God gives an Italian barber's son as a joke, soft, warm, as if a glass of red wine was being poured with every note. In 1946, he met Jerry Lewis. Martin and Lewis, for 10 years, they sat at the peak of American entertainment, movies, television shows, Las Vegas residencies. But Jerry kept being Jerry Lewis off stage too, loud, demanding, controlling. Dean was quiet off stage, and that silence became the chasm that split them apart. In 1956, they separated. Hollywood said Dean would sink on his own. Dean Martin was nothing without Jerry Lewis. That sentence was written everywhere from Variety to The Hollywood Reporter that year. But Dean didn't sink, quite the opposite. When he was alone, he began building that famous mask. He picked up the glass filled with apple juice. He half closed his eyes. He dropped his shoulders, and he created the most carefree man in the world. That character worked so well that eventually even Dean himself forgot where he ended, and the character began. He became a father of 7, married 3 times, but the man who was the star of Hollywood's biggest parties went to bed every night at 9 o'clock. And then came The Tonight Show. The first time Dean Martin sat across from Johnny Carson, something hard to describe happened between them. Chemistry doesn't do it justice. These two men recognized each other. Carson carried the loneliness he hid behind the brightest smile in television history. Dean carried the silence he hid behind America's greatest party man act. They were both masters of the same craft, being a different man when the camera was on. But back then, no one could have imagined the night when both masks would crack at the same time. On The Tonight Show set, Dean Martin had his own rules, or rather his own way of ignoring the rules. One Thursday night in 1975, he walked onto the stage and refused to sit down. The orchestra played. McMahon shouted his name. The audience rose to their feet. Dean stood in the center of the stage, tuxedo flawless, glass in hand, swaying gently. Carson pointed to the chair. "Are you going to sit down?" Dean shrugged. "I don't think so, John. I'm not staying that long." The audience laughed, but Dean really didn't sit down. He stayed on his feet for a few minutes, cracked a few jokes, and left the stage. Carson stayed calm because he understood. Dean Martin was a man who did everything in life on his own terms, or not at all. This wasn't stubbornness. It was the last line of defense of a man who refused to be controlled. Stage Dean made everyone laugh. Once, while sharing a couch with George Gobel, he secretly flicked his cigarette ashes into Gobel's drink. Carson saw it but said nothing, biting his lip to hold back his laughter. These were the moments that made The Tonight Show gold. Chaos that looked uncontrolled, but was actually masterfully orchestrated by Dean. These moments tell you what happened in front of the camera, but what happened behind the camera was an entirely different story. When the cameras stopped, the smile on Dean's face faded as fast as the stage lights. He would sit alone in the makeup room, door closed, lights dim, the laughter in the hallway, the clinking glasses, the "Dean, come have a drink" calls stayed on the other side of the door. Dean would sit, look in the mirror, and quietly pull himself together in an empty room. A studio worker recounted years later, everyone wanted to party with Dean Martin, but Dean Martin didn't want to party with anyone. He was the loneliest crowded man I ever knew. At home, it was no different. 3 marriages, all 3 hit the same wall. Dean struggled to show love. Saying "I love you" was a physically difficult act for him, as if those words had rusted somewhere in Steubenville's steel mills. He loved his children, each of his 7 kids, in his own silent way, but his way of expressing that love was to be in the same room and say nothing. His eldest son, Dean Paul, was closest to him, a handsome, athletic, fearless young man. He wanted to be a military pilot. Dean never stood in the way of that dream, but those close to him noticed that whenever the subject of flying came up, Dean gripped his glass a little tighter. And it was the story of that glass, Dean Martin's 30-year secret. That was the key to everything. The glass. The first image that comes to mind when you say Dean Martin. Glass in right hand, cigarette in left, eyes half closed. But that glass was far more than a stage prop. It was filled with apple juice. For 30 years, through thousands of shows, in front of millions of viewers, America's most famous drunk never touched a drop of alcohol on stage. This was a truth that even Dean's closest circle could only confirm years later. Shirley MacLaine couldn't hide her astonishment in an interview. Dean Martin was sober on stage, always, every show, every night. Why? Because control. There were many things Dean couldn't control in his life. His marriages, Hollywood's rules, people's expectations. But on stage, with that glass, everything was in his hands. By doing the drunk act, he was actually the most sober, the sharpest man in the room. The glass was his shield, his mask, his weapon. But shields don't last forever. And in 1978, in Studio One, Johnny Carson was going to reach for that shield and break it. On The Tonight Show set, everything began the way it always did. Dean walked on. Applause, orchestra, McMahon's voice. The glass was in place. The smile was in place. But Carson noticed something. The very first second Dean sat down at the desk, there was a weariness in Dean's eyes unlike any other time. Not the weariness of staying up late. The weariness of carrying something for a long time. Carson had known this man for 16 years, and he saw that weariness for the first time that night, or wanted to see it for the first time. As the show progressed, Dean kept up his performance. Jokes landed. The audience laughed. The glass never left his hand. But Carson's eyes were fixed on that glass. Tonight it looked less like a prop and more like a measure of the distance between 2 men. And then Carson did something he had never done in 4,531 episodes. Carson reached across the desk, slowly, not in a hurry, not like it was a bit, but like a man who had made a decision. His fingers closed around Dean Martin's glass. That glass, The mask of 30 years, the symbol of the fake drunkenness filled with apple juice. Dean's silent manifesto telling the world, "You think you know me, but you know nothing," was now in Johnny Carson's hand. Carson brought the glass to his lips. He took a sip, long, slow, deliberate. The audience laughed. Of course they laughed. Johnny Carson drinking from Dean Martin's glass. It had to be a bit. 300 people burst into laughter. But Carson didn't laugh. He didn't set the glass down. He looked at Dean, and something changed on Dean Martin's face. Those famous half-closed eyes opened fully for a moment. The carefree smile trembled. 1 second, maybe less, but it was there. The first crack in a 30-year mask. Carson saw it. The camera 2 operator saw it. Most of the audience didn't, because they were still laughing. 8 seconds. 8 seconds of silence on live television. A gap long enough for producers to reach for the commercial break button. But nobody pressed it, because what was happening on screen wasn't a malfunction. It was a moment of recognition. Carson set the glass slowly on the desk. He looked at Dean, and Dean Martin, the most carefree man in the world, the man who never took anything seriously, the man who turned everything into a joke, quietly lowered his head. "You know, John," Dean said. His voice was low, lower than the audience could hear, but the microphone caught it. "When I first started this act, it was a choice. I'd walk on stage, pick up the glass, narrow my eyes, and everyone would laugh. The control was mine. I chose when they laughed, when they went quiet." He paused, traced the rim of the glass with his finger. "But one day I woke up and realized it wasn't a choice anymore. It was a cage. Everyone loves drunk Dean, stage Dean, but when I take that guy off and put the real one on the table, the quiet one, the one who goes to bed at 9, nobody recognizes him. Nobody wants to. Stay with me. The part that will truly break you is coming now." Carson's hand rested on the desk. His fingers were trembling slightly, one of the rarest sights captured on camera in a 30-year television career. Then Carson did something that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. He stood up from behind the desk, walked around it, and sat down next to Dean Martin in the guest chair. 4,531 episodes. Johnny Carson had never once left his desk to sit in the guest chair. That desk was Carson's shield. What Dean's glass was to Dean, that desk was to Carson, and now he had abandoned it. "Dean," Carson said. His voice was different, not the television voice, the real one. "Winter of 1971. My third marriage was falling apart. Every night I did this show, smiled, told jokes, made 30 million people laugh. Then I'd go home, to that big house in Malibu, and the phone wouldn't ring. It never rang." Carson paused, swallowed. "America's most beloved man, Dean, but the man sitting in the dark at 3 in the morning in that big house waiting for the phone to ring, nobody ever saw him." Dean said nothing. He just raised his head and looked at Carson. Two men, one America's most beloved drunk, the other America's most beloved host, were acknowledging for the first time out loud what lay behind each other's masks. Dean picked up the glass, that famous glass, the one filled with apple juice, and held it out to Carson. Carson took it. He took another sip, and this time the audience didn't laugh, because this time everyone understood. This wasn't a bit. But the real secret of that night emerged after the cameras stopped. For 30 years, Dean Martin's glass had contained apple juice. America's most famous drunk had never touched a drop of alcohol on stage. Every show, every Tonight Show episode, every Las Vegas residency, always apple juice. It was a secret that only his closest circle could confirm years later. But the truly painful part of the secret wasn't that. The painful part was this. Off stage, when the cameras stopped, the real drinking began, especially at night, especially when he was alone. The great irony of Dean Martin's life was this. The stage drunk was sober, while the man who appeared sober was slowly breaking apart. The mask had grown so thick that it had become hard to breathe beneath it. And Carson knew this. Perhaps that was the real reason he had reached for the glass that night. It was his way of telling Dean, "I know your act. Because mine is no different from yours." When the camera stopped, Carson walked Dean to the green room himself. They sat there for 20 minutes. Nobody heard exactly what was said, but the cleaning crew member, who was the last to leave the studio that night, saw something on the green room table. Dean Martin's glass. It had been left there. The stage glass, the mask of 30 years, the last drops of apple juice still pooled at the bottom. Dean had walked out of the studio that night without his glass for the first time. The morning after the broadcast, NBC's switchboard lit up. Over 14,000 calls before noon. Not complaints, not requests. People calling to say they had seen something real. Letters began arriving within the week. A man from Ohio wrote that he had watched the show with his father, and when Carson reached for Dean's glass, his father, a steel worker who had never shed a tear, had gotten up and left the room. He came back 10 minutes later with red eyes and said nothing. A woman from Nevada wrote that she had been a waitress at one of Dean's Las Vegas shows for 8 years. "I always thought he was drinking. We all did. Now I understand. The loneliest man in the room was the one making everyone else laugh." The broadcast rippled outward. 3 newspapers ran features on the masks men wear. A psychologist in Los Angeles reported a 40% increase in new male patients that month. Men who called saying they had seen something on Carson and wanted to talk. For the first time, a late-night comedy show had done what no public service announcement had managed. It had given men permission to be fragile. Dean Martin's life after that night changed, though not in the way anyone hoped. He continued to perform, continued to smile, continued to carry the glass, but those who knew him said something had softened. He called his children more often. He stayed on the phone a little longer. He said a few more words. Then came 1987. Dean Paul Martin Jr., Dean's eldest son, the fearless young pilot, was killed when his F-4 Phantom jet crashed into the San Gorgonio Mountains during a snowstorm. They found the wreckage, but the mountain did not return the body for months. Dean Martin was never the same man again. The mask didn't crack, it shattered. He stopped performing. He stopped going out. He stopped answering the phone. The man who had made an entire career out of pretending nothing mattered finally encountered the one thing that mattered more than everything. Friends said that in the months following Dean Paul's death, Dean would sit in his Bel Air living room in the dark, a glass in his hand, but this time it wasn't apple juice. Johnny Carson, himself retired by then, withdrawn from the world, sent no public statement. But Dean's housekeeper confirmed that every year on the anniversary of Dean Paul's crash, a small package arrived at the Bel Air house. No return address. Inside, a single note card with Carson's handwriting. Nobody ever read what it said. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. The official cause was acute respiratory failure, but those who knew him said he had stopped living the day his son's plane went down. When they went through his belongings in the Bel Air house, they found the bedroom mostly bare. A man who had spent his life surrounded by everything had ended it surrounded by almost nothing. But on the nightstand, next to the bed where Dino Paul Crosetti took his last breath, sat a single object, an old glass. Not a crystal tumbler, not an expensive piece of barware, a simple, slightly scratched stage glass, the kind they used at NBC Burbank, the kind that once held apple juice, the kind that Johnny Carson had once reached for across a desk on a night when 2 men decided, for just a moment, to stop pretending. If this story moved you, subscribe right now. Share it with someone who has been carrying their glass for too long. Drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. And tell me this, what is the mask you wear? What is your glass? Because somewhere right now, someone is sitting alone in a room, holding a glass that everyone thinks is full, and nobody is reaching for it.